All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Happy to be joining you today, and I hope you're all doing well in the midst of continued lockdown, strife, and tension across the country. And today, I'm happy to have a guest who can speak to all of that and more. Wilfred Reilly is an assistant professor of political science at Kentucky State University. You can follow him on Twitter at Will_the_Beast630, which is a great name. He is the author of multiple books, including Hate, Crime, Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War, and Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Wilfred, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Sure, yeah, glad to be on.
I want to talk to you about a number of different issues, but first off, I just want to ask you, as someone who has a perspective that I think is pretty unique and is not necessarily the one that you would hear from the typical media space. What are your thoughts about this moment and the way that the media has been covering the reaction to and the actions by in the wake of the tragic death of George Floyd, the actions by these protesters, many of whom have often turned to looting and violence in some pretty sad ways?
Quite frankly, I think that the media, by which I mean the mainstream, primarily center-left, although the right media is often no better on this, but the mainstream mass media in the United States, to some extent, is responsible for a lot of these tensions that we're seeing. One of my favorite books of all time is The Culture of Fear by Barry Glassner. And Glassner is apolitical. I mean, I suppose he's probably center-left, but he's a quant college professor. And he became interested in why people are scared of all this crap that's not going to kill us. And so he goes through a bunch of these different things, like the kidnapping of young girls, which if you are a parent, you remember that late 90s. I mean, that panicked everyone. That panicked, my older relatives. Every couple of weeks, there was one of these terrible stories, Little Amber and so on, running on the media. He looks at plane crashes. Something like a third of all people are scared to fly. He looks at shark attacks, and he actually breaks down the numbers. And what he finds is that most of these dreaded plagues are really, really uncommon. For the parents out there, I mean, the total number of young girls, black or white or any other group, that are kidnapped permanently under 10, anyone other than a relative in the United States, is like 50 annually. And you understand when you think about that it kind of would have to be. I mean, would you be able to walk into the typical armed working or middle-class neighborhood, go to a park as an adult male, grab a kid, walk out, no one stops you, no one calls the police? Likely not. It turns out that very rarely happens. Similarly, I mean, the number of people killed per year by sharks, about 8. I don't think we need to dwell on that one. Plane crashes, less than 500 a year. We're terrified of these things, Glassner said, because the media benefits from, today it would be clicks, he says, views, but people tuning into things that they're existentially afraid of and feeling that little tremor of terror. And the media has definitely exploited that with two recent stories, COVID-19 and the protests and riots following the death of George Floyd. The COVID-19 thing, now, I, unlike many on the center and right, wouldn't say any sort of nonsense like COVID-19 is a hoax. But I do think that the initial presentation of COVID-19 by the mass media was extremely inaccurate, and it had the effect of terrifying entire countries, often into shutdown. When you look at the original projections around COVID-19, and I'm not just talking out of let's PG and say thin air here, I'm actually one of the stats guys on a paper that's going into one of the major medical journals dealing with COVID-19, written with a couple of physicians. I still try to get my academic work in. But I mean, the original projections, I mean, you had Neil Ferguson at Imperial College saying that the IFR, not CFR, for the disease would be roughly 1%. 80% of people would get it very rapidly, no matter what we did. He implied that mitigation strategies like masking up, well-done social distancing wouldn't work. So the projection was, unless we locked down, 2.2 million people would die, which is a level of death where you're thinking corpses in the streets. And he wasn't alone. I mean, Pueo, the well-known tech exec, he said possible IFR of 4%, 10 million did. WHO, using that initial Chinese data, 3.4%. Now, after months of this, where most people did lock down, most people did follow the rules most of the time, we see that the actual projected IFR for COVID-19 is 0.26%, according to the CDC. That's what we kind of try to keep our mouths shut, not doctors, but that's what a lot of people in that quant general science community had thought all along, quite frankly. And there were people like Dr. Ioannidis at Stanford that had said this and that had essentially not had that message relayed through the media. So we got, 90 days, 100 days of these damn panic stories. Can you touch the vegetables? Can COVID-19 live on a flat surface? You know, these Dracula-like descriptions of this coronavirus. And then it just stopped, flat, dead. A couple days after the CDC gave what probably, my opinion, is the actual IFR, although of course, consult your physician. Days after that happened, we went back to this older panic narrative of race war. Mm-hmm. So you saw the George Floyd video, and the George Floyd video was legitimately horrible, but it was the decision of media outlets to play it 20 times over in what in social science we call down and to the right fashion. Now let's look at this from another angle. To do things like, I didn't see a play of that video where it showed that 2 of the 4 officers on the scene were non-white. So you're focusing on one Caucasian guy, there are 3 cops restraining Floyd, you're playing the video over and over again. You're not discussing any context facts. I'll provide some. This is a chapter of Taboo. Obviously, real racism is bad, but there's not any sort of ongoing race war in the USA, certainly not one initiated by white conservatives. If you look at actual police violence last year, according to the Washington Post database on police shootings, there's some changes to it that I don't fully understand from time to time, but
yeah, neither do I.
Yeah, it went from 9 to 15 recently, but kind of the gold standard here. Some issues. But the point is, the total number of unarmed black men killed by police last year, maximum, was 15. Mm-hmm. Total number of unarmed individuals, including whites and Hispanics, killed by police last year was 56. So you don't even see a radical disproportion there for African Americans at all, much less if you make a slight adjustment for crime rate. African Americans are nearly 15% of the population. So those are the actual numbers, and you could go beyond that. There are there are 1,004 people in the most recent year on record killed by police total. Again, 229 of them were identified as blacks or as African Americans. Again, you're talking about 22%. Those are the numbers on police violence. And you could extend beyond that into interracial crime. I recently read the Bureau of Justice Statistics report, thinking about a potential paper. The total number in 2018, this time, of interracial white on black incidents was under 100,000. All in, blacks made up only 15% of those to attack whites, which is, again, pretty much directly proportional. Whites did even better, if you will, made up 11.6% of those to attack blacks. So there's no interracial crime, by the way. Not only is it extremely rare, person most likely to kill you is your ex-wife, it is also, real fact, or your current husband if you're a woman, but it also in the United States is disproportionately black on white. We need to be honest about that. Just as there are issues like suicide and opiates in white communities, crime is an issue in many black communities. So you're talking about 5% of crime, let's say, if you're comparing these interracial violent crimes, black-white violent crimes to all crimes, 12 million crimes. And of that 5% of crime, 80% is POC on white. Those are the actual facts. Police violence, again, the actual facts are 9 to 15 men. If you're looking at that WAPO database, black men killed while unarmed. None of this was ever said by the media. So you had this video of this man being crushed to death, terrible video, and the context being provided seemed almost intentionally to be misleading. USA Today ran an editorial, the USA Today network of papers, ran an editorial by someone who I'm sure is passionate and sincere. The author is A. Williams. But it was headlined, "Your Black Friends Feel Fear Every Day, Every Single Day." And this was typical of the kind of media content we saw, where what was going on was presented as epidemic, constant, violence is on the verge of ethnic war. And that was something that was done intentionally that very much could have been done differently. So I assign a fair amount of blame to the media for both the COVID-19 and the George Floyd narratives. And we see what happens when you show an incident of racial violence 200 times to a country full of people that have been out of work for 3 months. I mean, you get crowds in the street, and that's entirely predictable. And just as with the LA riots, I mean, I think there's a degree of responsibility there.
There's all types of images that came out from these various protests where you see this weird situation where it's white college age people in the streets screaming Black Lives Matter at cops who are often Black or Hispanic. The Post has written about this. There's been some pretty incredible images from New York and elsewhere. And to me, that makes for a very bizarre scene. And it seems more like a performative act that we're LARPing as civil rights heroes, as opposed to actually recognizing that when you say defund the police and replace them with a bunch of social workers, what you're actually saying is take a bunch of working class jobs held by a significant portion of Black, Hispanic, and minority members of the community, and let's start, appointing a bunch of social workers who went to expensive institutions to replace them. The thing is, though, that if you are someone who's just observing this, you're not in the street like most of Americans, there's enormous pressure being brought by either those protesters or their analogs within the corporate community who are saying, you need to present yourself as an ally. You need to read Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist. You need to do these things to continue this performance and to show that you are on the right side of this argument. How should those people feel in this moment? And what's your perspective on the weird racial divide that we're seeing at these protests?
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, so first of all, I agree there was an element of LARPing to it. I mean, one of the things I jokingly said on Twitter was that, I'm still a younger guy. I kept seeing these pictures of, people in sort of sexy rioter outfits posing for Twitter and Instagram, doing things like suggestively holding what were supposed to be Molotov cocktails and so on. So when you look at that, you do think, I mean, like a lot of these people are out there to have fun to some extent. I mean, you often see pictures of looters smiling. They don't look like they're passionately concerned with George Floyd, to fight the police, to get out of the house in the sun. I mean, definitely, I do think there's a huge element of LARPing to Antifa, for example, if you want to use that generic term for Black bloc kids in the first place. Like when I started watching the videos of the original Minneapolis riot, I mean, the first question my fiance asked is, who are all these white guys in the ninja suits? I mean, you don't want to laugh at it, but what are these boys doing? I mean, there was that guy that showed up, the dreadlocked Caucasian kid who had a chainsaw and was cutting down lamp poles. And it's not funny, but I do think a lot of people were out there reenacting the Purge movie.
Yes.
I actually was reading Paradise Lost recently because I'm an intellectual. And one of the things you realize is that the devil's a lot more fun than God.
Oh, absolutely. He gets all the best lines.
Yeah, it has all the best music. I mean, but that's one of the temptations in life. Like, why wouldn't you go brawl and have sex in the streets and throw fire bombs at, these officers that always pull you over and steal a new Broussard painting from the museum and put it on your wall? And the answer has to be, well, civilization, bro. But I mean, civilization's a thin veneer. And sure, we saw some people out there play acting. Like, I don't think my man with the chainsaw really is familiar. Like, Abraham Kennedy, I mean, I'm not a man of the left, but there's nothing wrong with reading that book. But I don't think that guy's read it. Mm-hmm. I don't think he's maybe read like a comic book of the Communist Manifesto, but there's something that's very old in humanity that's driving that kind of street fighting, and it's not philosophy. But I mean, moving on, you can certainly have fun with it and tweak the people in the stupid outfits, wielding weapons and so on. But the image you described to me as a Black businessman isn't entertaining at all, actually. I mean, you're absolutely right. And by the way, we can't excuse the Black and Hispanic and so on rioters. I do think that one narrative on the center right that's fairly easy is, oh, this mob was 50% Caucasian. Let's focus on these sort of Antifa bros. Let's keep it there. Let's ignore race issues. If you're rioting in the streets, you're rioting in the streets. I mean, I noticed a lot of people of all colors out there. I'm not even sure it was majority white in most cities. But you definitely did see in cities like Minneapolis and Portland, those are primarily white cities, mobs of Caucasian thugs burning down Black businesses while chanting Black Lives Matter. I said that almost in passing on the Tucker Carlson show and got an incredible reaction to it because I think most Americans realize how insane that is. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's an inherent element to which that's not funny at all. Those people from, and of course rioting isn't when you really analyze it, but I mean, those people from, Black bloc location, whatever, are going to go back home to the suburbs, and the neighborhood that they destroyed is going to remain destroyed.
Yeah.
In Minneapolis, that Lake Street district was a working income, heavily Asian business community. I actually printed out, because I was interested in GoFundMe donations, a list of the businesses that were destroyed. And it was places like Scores Sports Bar, which is a well-known Black-owned sports venue. I think they were opening a second location, and that's described as a new business. Plaza Mexico, the International Bazaar, so on. So yeah, a large element of LARPing, a large element of real damage done by these people that were literally playing with fire. Now, when you get into how should people in corporate America react to this, one of the things you have to understand is that for a lot of the people behind movements like this wasn't something that started with George Floyd. One thing you've seen with a lot of these movements from the activist left recently, whether you're talking about the Green New Deal, which in my opinion as a political scientist is bat bleep insane. I've read it. It includes things like killing the main American dairy herd, if I recall correctly.
Yes.
If you look at that, if you look at the actual platform of the movement for Black Lives, which I encourage everyone to read, like page 3 is Free Palestine. Mm-hmm. If you look at the demands made by these protesters, they go very, very far beyond anything to do with Mr. Floyd's killing. And I think in corporate America, people have to show some guts, let's say politely, and say, no, we're against police brutality too, but no, I don't see what paying into a corporate reparations fund or something like that has to do with George Floyd. The thing about the George Floyd killing that's so remarkable is that everybody agreed. Yeah. Like the day after George Floyd's death, I was extremely relieved because I thought there would be no rioting, no violence, because you immediately saw the leaders on both sides come out. You didn't see any extreme wokery at first from Pelosi or AOC. You didn't see any attempt to defend the officers from Rush or Ben Shapiro. You saw people just say, look, this is a bad cop. You get some bad cops. Let's arrest this guy. And that, I think, was the correct solution. An incredible sentence. Before the George Floyd riots, all 4 officers involved had already been fired and had already been told they were probably going to face charges. That's it. That's the solution. So all of this other stuff with people going into the streets and burning minority businesses because we're fighting for justice, broadly defined. The question is, what does that mean? And if it turns out that what it means is we're going to defund all police, or no Black man should be an officer, or we need reparations plus affirmative action, then I think a lot of Americans are going to be justified in saying, look, I'm a taxpayer. No. That's my opinion on how corporations should respond. They should think about what their corporate policy is. They should think about who one thing, I don't want to ramble here, but they should think about who their actual customer base is. Mm-hmm. Coming from a business perspective, I don't understand a lot of decisions that American business has made in the past 6 to 18 months. When you see, for example, Dick's Sporting Goods saying that they're not going to sell rifles anymore, or Walmart in rural areas no longer selling handgun ammunition, or the NFL is thinking about breaking with sort of the American flag pro-police demonstrations they've had at games. I don't know who they think their customer base is, but I don't see a lot of green-haired woke 17-year-olds at pro football games or in the gun shop. So, for corporate America, what should you do? You should think about what your actual policy positions are, your ethical positions are, who your customer base is, and then make a decision. You can read Ibrahim X. Kennedy if you want to, but I'd recommend reading Thomas Sowell as well. But reading both of those books doesn't really have a damn thing to do with what you ought to have on the shelves and so on. I don't think having your executives out there marching in protest or symbolically apologizing for being white is going to do much for your stock price, really.
I've never had a problem as a consumer with all the places that make these ridiculous, often over-the-top claims about how good they are as a corporation. My first job was at a Starbucks, and they do that crap all the time. Yeah. It's like, okay, let's be honest. At the end of the day, you make coffee, or you sell people overpriced milk. The point is that, like, I think people kind of factor in, Budweiser is sponsoring a bunch of rainbow flags. What do I care? I just want a beer. Yeah. The danger becomes, I think, when that type of corporate wokeness seeps into the culture at a place. And we see this mostly right now within the media landscape, but I think it's spreading beyond that. where people, particularly young people, have this new vocabulary that they use where they talk about someone's ideas making them feel unsafe. In other words, it's not enough that you don't want to wear the ribbon. It's the fact that you don't want to wear the ribbon makes me feel unsafe in my workplace. We now need to adjudicate that as an HR issue. And I think you see that a little bit in the performative displays by Democratic leadership on Capitol Hill yesterday, where they're all going and kneeling in silence for almost 9 minutes, wearing their kente. And personally, I think that looks a little bit ridiculous. Jordan Peele, in fact, retweeted a meme of the parents from Get Out wearing their kente cloth today, and comparing it to those Democrats. From your perspective, is there a way to respond and push back as an individual if you feel like the place that you're working, the firm that you're at, the business that you're a part of is putting pressure on you to declare allegiance in a certain sense, to say, oh yes, no, I will get down on my knee, or I will acknowledge my privilege, or I will wear the kente, and I will do that in order for me to keep my job. Isn't there a way to adjudicate this as Americans where we don't have to have, monolithic politics within the corporate atmosphere?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there. I'll probably give another long rambling answer, but I mean, so I actually got into it with Wendy's on Twitter about this.
Really?
Wendy's, first of all, Wendy's has really well-run social media. Like, I don't have an overall beef with Wendy's.
They're pretty funny, yeah.
No pun intended. But me and Pigtails got into it a little bit because Wendy's posted something just ridiculously patronizing. It was something like, we're going to be making the following donations and appearing at the following events because we recognize that without Black hip-hop culture, or something along those lines, we wouldn't be anything. And I responded and said, look, why would a diner-style hamburger, I'm a Black guy, I'm very pro-Black, although I lean a little bit right. Why would a diner-style hamburger restaurant founded by Germans be nothing without Black culture? What are you talking about, Wendy's? Isn't this just corporate patronization? And Wendy's was like, yo, we dropped our mixtape because of how strongly we feel about hip-hop culture. You can still find this conversation online. And I just went into this, like, your mixtape? Who's on the Wendy's Hamburgers mixtape? It's apparently pretty fire from what I've heard, but I mean, come on. And there's this whole conversation, and I then asked, like, look,
the Wendy's. I you know what? I kind of remember this. I think I went to the Wendy's SoundCloud at some point.
Yeah,
because yes.
No, Wendy's is dropping tapes. I mean, like, but okay. Leaving that aside, because who cares? But I just said, look, I mean, this is a well-known, I believe, Midwestern, down-home hamburger franchise. You're not serving hamburgers with a Southwestern flair. You know, you're the guys with the bacon and the 2 types of cheese. What does any of this have to do with the hip-hop culture? And their response was, yo, our mixtape, bro. And I then went into this.
All respect for Dave Thomas, but Ray Kroc was the OG. So
OG fast food guy. No one ever mentions the Burger King these days. But anyway, I mean, but a conversation developed because I asked, look, and I don't even oppose this. This is your business decision. But didn't you guys give $400,000 to Trump? And that set off a panic. That's when they really started replying to me. They claimed, they like linked documents, and they claimed that this was a franchisee of Wendy's. It wasn't Wendy's. And the whole thing became incredibly bizarre because I didn't see a reason for Wendy's to claim that it was a bastion of Black culture in the first place. I didn't see a reason for Wendy's to deny giving a gift to, at least on the right, a fairly popular GOP president. But this sort of corporate virtue signaling wokeness is incredibly common. Mm-hmm. And I mean, another example, the New York Times opinion page editor was just fired because people thought the New York Times opinion page was too conservative. Yeah. I mean, this is, or technically I suppose he resigned, but this is another example of what we're talking about. And the language that you're describing was very specifically used during this situation. Staffer said he made New York Times men and women of color feel unsafe. He decided to publish an op-ed by, I believe, Senator Cotton, which simply said, use non-lethals if at all possible, but send in the military to secure these historic sites and stop these riots. I think probably 55% of Americans would agree with that, at least regionally. Nothing really there, but the claim was that that editorial would expose anyone of color in the city to violence, as though the soldiers were going to be marching down the street shooting at random. And this went on and on and on until the poor guy basically was let go. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's really interesting here is the one-sidedness of this on the woke left. I will say I'm probably center right. I don't necessarily think the hard evangelical right would be much better if they were in power in terms of censoring speech. Wendy's might not be dropping mixtapes depending on how long they were in power. But on the social justice left, which is currently dominant, this only cuts one way, and it's ridiculously annoying. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, for example, the New York Times running a center-right editorial is dismissed as making people unsafe. Actual riots are described as mostly peaceful. So you have this extraordinarily bizarre dichotomy where speech is violence, but violence is justified rebellion. Now, your real question was, how should people respond to this if they are in a young executive role in corporate America? I mean, I think there are a lot of different ways to respond to it. One of the most common that I see in practice is simply setting up an anonymous presence online and in society and saying what you actually think. I don't necessarily endorse that, but I mean, I noticed that many of the people I argue with on Twitter have, avatars of Rosie the Riveter on the left or Thomas Jefferson on the right. It's not someone saying, my name is Mark Yiannopoulos and I live at X address and this is what I think. So, I mean, in practice, I think if you look at any comment section, you can see both what real radicals and actual conservatives think. Another option is just voting. I mean, if you're in one of these situations where you have a governor that banned the purchase of garden tools or something like that, I understand there's some technical details about, she didn't do that. She just made it impossible to go into this section of the store where they were sold. That's all. But I mean, if you have someone that's been behaving in that manner, I mean, I think it's logical to go in that sealed voting booth in November and vote against them. Mm-hmm. In day-to-day life, I always recommend bravery. I think you can always, to some extent, get another job. That's one of the things that keeps me fairly stable in terms of talking. Again, I'm a pro-black guy. I don't think I'm saying anything that's wildly controversial, but anything can be these days. And I suppose that I doubt KSU would, but if an employer at any point down the road had a problem with that, I mean, I think I'm pretty employable on sales floors, trading floors. I mean, I think you have to have some confidence in yourself. And I think if you really view your boss as being abusive, you have to think about moving on or at least politely expressing yourself. A lot of this can just be avoided. I mean, if someone asked me to do something I considered extraordinarily humiliating, I probably just would say no. If you don't want to wear kente cloth to work because you view it as silly and performative, don't, would be a piece of advice. I mean, if someone asks you to politely say, well, I don't want to for whatever made up reason, go to HR at need if they're at all sympathetic. But I think many people resolve these issues by in their private life striking back. I mean, giving money, voting, so on down the line, selling stock. Beyond telling the truth and privately trying for change, I'm not sure what you can do, but those two things seem pretty effective.
I think that the pain or the challenge that a lot of people are facing is that at one point it's something for the people who work within the media landscape to be quote unquote canceled, either as celebrities or, for instance, the editor of Bon Appetit, had to resign. The top editor at the Philly Inquirer, who wrote an editorial that said, I believe, buildings matter too, in reaction to rioting and destruction, also had to resign. The woman who runs Refinery 29 had to resign. It's like this, a regular sort of situation in terms of these people at the upper echelons of media being called out for being insufficiently supportive of diversity in the workplace or things along those lines. But from my perspective, the challenge is, look, I'm happy to be in support of having, more diverse views or more diverse experiences in backgrounds as part of any workplace. But when you say something like Black Lives Matter, you're not just saying a slogan. It's not just a hashtag. It stands for something. And that something includes, as you said before, Free Palestine. They're in favor of the BDS movement. They support defunding the police. They even added it to the mural that Mayor Bowser in Washington, D.C. had drawn on the street. Uh, how can people navigate a world in which, if you won't go along with that, if you're not putting the black square on your Instagram, which is easily the stupidest, performative thing that I've seen thus far, then I think that there's a real feeling of tension and pressure there among people who basically say, hey, look, I'm in favor of police reform. I'm in favor of justice for people who do terrible policing, or who make mistakes, or even intentionally do bad things that result in the death of innocent people, or people who did low-level crimes that should never have such a ramification for them. But I'm not going to go along with this just titanic push in favor of a woke race-based agenda.
Well, I have a couple of different levels of advice there. Pretty broad reach podcast. I'll speak to people at a couple levels and see if they listen to anything I'm saying. First, as an investor, my advice to corporate entities would be, don't do this. Yeah. There's a famous quote from Michael Jordan, who's easily the wealthiest athlete entertainer of all time, which is just, Republicans buy sneakers too. Someone asked him why he didn't get into a contested race in North Carolina between an honestly pretty left black guy. I don't think that's where Mike Jordan's politics are, and an incredibly alleged racist on the other side. And Jordan obviously wasn't too geeked about either candidate and just said, I might give a little money, but Republicans buy sneakers too, i.e., unless there's a heroic champion in this race that I really want to get behind, I don't see a reason as a businessman to come out and make this sort of public statement about heated political affairs. And there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, Jordan still outsells LeBron and all those guys combined today. So I think if you're a corporation, your goal should be making money for your leadership team, your investors, your stockholders, your employees. You shouldn't necessarily be trying to make woke statements in the first place. I mean, Wendy's should be thinking about new locations to drop the Baconator in. I mean, they should have absolutely there's nothing wrong with them having a genuine political point of view, but if they don't, and they seem to virtue signal about 20 times a year and to do it less than most other corporate players, there's no financial reason to do this. Unless a business genuinely, passionately believes in freedom for Palestine, and I doubt many do. I mean, Nike is credibly accused of employing slaves every couple of years. They should probably really focus on paying their taxes and making their shoes. I guess where I'm going with this, there's not going to be a reward to corporate America from getting involved in these kind of fights. That is more the point than any sort of moral argument. I think a lot of businesses fear boycotts and things along those lines. The simple reality is that almost nobody is going to dig deep into your institutional politics if you make a good chicken sandwich.
Yeah.
I mean, Chick-fil-A was accused, I think it turned out to be one of the executives, but of giving money to a campaign in this guy's private capacity that opposed gay marriage. That doesn't stop anyone, including, I'll openly say me, from eating chicken there. We've seen absolutely no decline in their market share since that happened. In fact, where we usually see declines in market share is after someone tries to get woke and someone on the other side smacks them down. Mm-hmm. So you saw one of the major airlines a couple of years back gave a slight reduction in seat price to the NRA. I think it's probably Southwest, down in a heavily hunting region of the country. They had a good relationship with the National Rifle Association. So you could get $80 off the price of your seat if you were an NRA member that flew. And all time, this had probably saved the NRA something like $20,000. It was a small, irrelevant thing. To virtue signal after a school shooting, they dropped this benefit that they offered to the NRA. And a governor from one of the southern states took away $25 million in tax breaks from them because he happened to be an NRA member. So I think that if you are in business, obviously you should pay your taxes and not break the law, but sending out your personal statement on Me Too or something like that is not something that's going to make you more or less money. And it's not something that's going to save your store if there happens to be a riot near that building. What I would say to people, because I mean, I was a wee junior executive myself just a couple of years back. I worked for companies like Marcus Evans and that sales and trading floor region of Chicago. First of all, there's an element of tact. Like if you just got married and you know you're going to get fired if you don't wear some piece of clothing or a red ribbon or whatever. I mean, I would probably wear it to work. And just in my own life, whether that's social media whether that's voting, whether that's major contributions to different groups. I would make my actual feelings known. But two, I think it's a fairly small percentage of upper middle class entities that really require people to do this.
Yeah.
It's not that hard to find a job in sales, in the markets, in alternative media, in conservative media, in industry, where people aren't going to make you wear the appropriate hat for every ethnic holiday. So I would encourage people to look outside of that DC, New York, Washington bubble. I did myself. I mean, I was from downtown Chicago, which is a considerably larger city than, for example, DC. That's where I'd lived much of my life. The furthest I'd moved other than college was to a nearby suburb that had 400,000 people in it. And when I actually started looking for colleges where, you know, my perspective would be cool, where you had students that wanted to come there and learn, diverse mix of kids, I mean, I wound up in Kentucky. So keep your private life private and do whatever the hell you want in your private life. Explore your options. Those are two big points. A third and final point would be, one thing both the lockdown protests and the George Floyd protests show is that business and the government fear people moving together. People treat the lockdown protest and the Floyd protest as dramatically different. What I see in both cases is the state giving a hell of a lot of ground to a group of several hundred people that look like they can fight. And what that implies to me is that if you stand up alone and say something obvious, you might well get smacked down. If you stand up with 100 other people and say something obvious, you probably won't. There's actually a document I've seen on social media. I haven't signed it because I'm not a big pledge signer, but it's the courage statement. It's the idea I'm not going to turn, if I'm asked by HR, I'm not going to turn in my friends for social justice violations. I'm willing to look throughout my level at the company and find other people that want to speak normally. And, you know, the bottom line is, like, I'm not a bigot. I'm not doing any of this for evil reasons, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm a free American. I'm going to keep talking. I think that in many businesses, it might be a good idea to sound out people and see who agrees with that. Mm-hmm. And the more people that stand up and say, no, we're not going to stop doing our critical research tomorrow because it's science blackout day or some such thing, the more likely that business is going to be to say, okay. The old line is, I mean, if you owe the bank $1,000, you're in real trouble. If you owe the bank $1 million, the bank's in real trouble. People need to start organizing and talking and seeing how many actual people agree with the things they're saying. Mm-hmm. One quick final line here. Yeah. On Twitter, without endorsing either side of these positions really, but I've asked people anonymously. Twitter has a great polling resource. You can put 4 or 5 lines on there. I've asked people how many of them actually believe in kind of woke core tenets, like your upper middle class black buddies are oppressed, was one of them. Another was not just in gender terms, but to the point where this should be treated as a matter of biological sex. People can transition from female to male and vice versa. Like, the specific question there was, should biological males who identify as women be allowed to compete with females in athletics? And every time I've asked one of these questions, only 2 or 3 people have said yes. In the comments under the question, it's like 80%, yes, of course, how could I say anything else? And the actual anonymous responses, it's 95% no. I don't believe my upper middle class Asian buddy is oppressed. Mm-hmm. And I think that the more people understand that the emperor has no clothes on a lot of these issues, I mean, Hamas is not a good government, the more willing they will be to say, in many cases, the obvious. Of course, the majority of Americans support using some level of force to defend businesses from criminals. Of course, the majority of Americans, you know, we're sympathetic for people's individual identification, but don't necessarily want biological males competing in sport against their daughter. Of course, the majority of Americans don't think I'm a brutalized victim sitting here in my Brooks tweed, you know, and I think that as people start to understand that through these sideline, unapproved conversations, we may see some level of normalcy return.
I want to ask you, you've mentioned a couple times that you're from Chicago, about this divide that happens in terms of coverage. You mentioned how much the media replayed the George Floyd video. We're talking in the aftermath of one of the deadliest weekends that Chicago has faced in 60 years. More than 80 people shot, more than 20 people killed, obviously mostly happening, as it does so often, within the Black community in Chicago. An enormous problem, and it's led to the leaking, in fact, of this conversation between the mayor and 50 aldermen in Chicago that got pretty heated. I don't know if you've heard it or not, but they're profanity and everything else. I wonder what your opinion is.
An hour.
Yeah, I wonder what your opinion is, both of that situation and of why something like that, which to me, as tragic and as awful as the George Floyd situation is, to your point earlier, the cops have been fired. They're going to be charged. They were charged. And like, to me, the protest would make sense if the system had not responded.
Exactly.
And in Chicago, I see a situation where the system is utterly failing these people, and it's failing them on a weekly basis.
Yep.
And I don't understand why that isn't a bigger story, and one that should have us completely animated. And, if you're going to be in the streets for the death of George Floyd, shouldn't you be more in the streets for something that is clearly a failure of systems and hierarchies and leadership and multiple politicians, and one that doesn't seem to be getting any better anytime soon?
Well, that's an old question. I mean, I've heard it phrased from conservative friends as, why doesn't Black Lives Matter, which seems to have some fairly solid, young male fighters in the front rank, protest at abortion clinics or in front of gang trap houses? I mean, if you want things that, hurt Black people, I've heard left-wing friends say military recruiting stations, although I disagree with that one. But I mean, if you want things that kill Black people, cheap automobile dealerships, obviously there are many things that cause death in our society. Mm-hmm. So the point, okay, kind of just getting to the point here, I think that it's obviously the case that the mainstream media can create a narrative out of virtually anything that they want to. Because humans are not elves. We're all going to die. And that's usually going to be pretty unfortunate, pretty unpleasant. So if the media chose to focus on every incident, bluntly, every incident of Black or poor white crime, you could easily create that narrative that we had in the 80s, which was, crime is rampant in the streets. It would be extraordinarily easy to focus on each one. There were 18 people killed in Chicago on one single day, which I believe was last Saturday, as the police began to pull back as a result of the George Floyd protest. It would be extraordinarily easy, and I'm not sure why a conservative station hasn't opted to do this, but to focus on every one of these people and do a 5-minute say her name style bio and describe, this is the tragedy of depolicing. So once we accept this, I mean, you could set up a narrative of crime in the cities, or for that matter, the trailer park. You could set up a narrative around what depolicing would mean. You could set up a narrative around police brutality. You can really make a narrative around anything that has more than, say, 10 incidents in a particular year. You can simply run those videos and say, this is the thing to fear. COVID-19, in addition to reality, contained a great deal of a panic narrative in terms of how that story was covered, how that story was treated. I find today that when I do any sort of survey work about this, just casual, low level at this point, but I mean, most people don't know the average COVID victim is 82. They estimate about half of that. Most people don't know, Free Op, the center-right think tank, did a great piece on this. Most people don't know 47% of those victims came out of the nursing homes. The thing that caused New York's COVID-19 tragedy was the decision of the state's widely praised governor to send COVID-positive patients back into nursing homes, which is insane. That is an extremely bad, complete failure of leadership.
And just personally, it that resulted in the deaths of 2 people that we actually know. And so it's a terrible thing. And I think that that's the sort of thing that's going to be subject to lawsuits and stuff going forward. But continue.
Let's hope it is. I mean, that's an extreme. If you look at why Florida, or for that matter, my home state of Illinois, did better, people make jokes like, well, New York is, the USA's leader in everything. And unfortunately, that was true for COVID. Not really. I mean, Chicago or Miami are nearly equally sized competitor cities that did not see those levels of death. And that is because the decision was handled better. It was handled in a different manner. In Florida, they absolutely refused to release anyone who was COVID positive from the hospital, and then they refused to admit them into those assisted care facilities, where they were typhoid Marys, essentially, where vulnerable people had no chance. Mm-hmm. But I mean, so the initial point there, though, I think we agree on some of the leadership failures there, is simply you can create a narrative pretty easily. The narrative that has been created by the mass media is the narrative of police brutality. We are all George Floyd. You hear people saying that kind of thing. The reality is that the numbers of people that are going to be hurt by any significant pullback of policing, or the numbers of people that are hurt by crime in the USA, especially in Black communities, are orders of magnitude higher than the numbers of people annually that are killed by fatal police brutality. So like that Lightfoot clip, again, you get into Lori Lightfoot in general, as with COVID, has been a fairly strong mayor, actually, to give some credit where due. But this was, again, an absolute failure of leadership. What the aldermen were saying essentially is this sort of let them destroy attitude resulted in the looting of many businesses throughout Black, Hispanic, and Eastern European wards of Chicago. And the question was, why do you not send in as many cops as possible? Why do you not call on the guard? What are we going to have? The alderman for a working class Hispanic community asked. And actually, as I understand in that community, bluntly on the ground in Chicago, the local gangs and just the men in the neighborhood have started patrolling the area with machetes and axes and so on.
Isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing how the mobs and the gangs start standing up and actually?
Well, I mean, if you mean by mob, you mean the actual traditional Italian mafia people still deny exists in Chicago. There's some businesses that aren't going to be burnt, Haas. Yep. I mean, that's if you get to the point where you make gangsters grease up the old Tommy gun and sit in front of their barbershop, they're going to do it. The problem is, and I mean, to a certain extent, I'm sympathetic with that. I mean, you saw the quote unquote rooftop Koreans during the LA riots. That became a bit of a right-wing meme, but those guys were there because the LAPD said they couldn't protect their businesses. Mm-hmm. And they took a poll of the young males in Koreatown, found out how many fighting men they had, and put them on roofs with rifles. And from that point forward, there were virtually no burnings of Korean-owned businesses. I do not believe you have a duty to be peaceful to those who actively attack you. If looters kick in the door of your shop, I mean, they're taking a life and death risk there, much less your house. So, I mean, we are seeing ordinary citizens respond. But to some extent, ordinary citizens, no matter how heroic or criminal, shouldn't have to respond to mob violence because the government should do it for them. That's why we pay all these damn taxes. The idea is that there is an institutional system that has cops, that has soldiers, that has mailmen, that's going to handle most of these minor issues within Chicago. So, I mean, what you're seeing is almost a reaction of real individuals to narrative that now creates a set of failures that have to be spun into a second narrative. So the narrative was, peaceful protests. We don't want to see police brutality. Lightfoot, in response, didn't want to be one of the few big city mayors to respond with brutal violence. So she did not send in the police. And what happened is that neighborhoods were destroyed. I've seen pictures from on the ground in some of those neighborhoods, like entire jewel stores were looted and nearly burnt. This isn't the car you're on fire you're seeing on TV. But now the spin has to be, well, the mostly peaceful protest did a little bit of damage, but our strong city will rebuild. In reality, as a leader, you have to ignore the flickering lights and the constant subtle background thrum of narrative and actually make decisions that will protect your people.
Mm-hmm. I want to close up our conversation by asking you a question about education. You are an educator. You are within higher ed at a pretty challenging time for a lot of people who have views that are not on the far left. Mm-hmm. And for the past several years, there's been this type of reporting. Robbie Suave at Reason has done probably the most famous work within that space, but so has Michael Moynihan at Vice and his coverage of Evergreen, and a number of other writers who have looked at the different situations playing out on campuses. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff wrote The Coddling of the American Mind. And basically it came down to, look, all these students are being taught these things that we view as basically dangerous and in many cases ahistorical perspectives about America as an irredeemably racist nation, and one that they have to view as kind of the worst of the worst, and is something that is going to be, just shot through with systemic racism. Mm-hmm. And the reason that a lot of us warned about this was because we didn't think it was going to stay on campus. We thought that it would migrate out. In recent weeks, even folks on the left, people as far left as Matthew Iglesias and others have come out and said, yeah, I was wrong about this stuff not just being confined to people being silly on campuses like they always are. Instead, it's something that has migrated into public square. And the fact that the New York Times Pulitzer-winning 1619 Project, headed up by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who, as you made reference to earlier, openly says destroying property is not violence, and also says
it is.
The Second Amendment, yes, and that the speech is, and that the Second Amendment is founded in white supremacy. So the question I have for you is this: looking at the product of the vast several years, decades really, of this brand of education as coming into the American experience, that's something that is a problem we're going to have to deal with. But we also have to address the educational side of the problem and make sure that this doesn't continue to be an issue for future students in future years. Do we have any good hope about that? Or is this a situation where higher ed is just so shot through with these things and that it's creeping into earlier and earlier grade levels in public schools, where people are given this, frankly, in my view, ahistorical or at least inaccurate vision of America as founded in racism, full of systemic racism, irredeemable, and something that frankly should be viewed through that lens and as something perhaps to be destroyed, either the statues or the founders or the things that they wrote, the basis of our nation?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. So first of all, this is a problem in higher education. I don't think anyone would deny that. I mean, we've seen books going back to at least the closing of the American mind talking about this kind of thing. One thing I will say from almost an amoral, again, business leadership perspective, it's stupid to teach your citizens to hate your country. Even if there are reasons that they probably should, it would be a silly thing to do. I mean, you should discuss things honestly, as briefly as possible, and move on to some extent. If you look at, with a real example would be some of the curriculum in Mongolia, where they just built a 50-foot high statue of Genghis Khan. I mean, there's an acknowledgement. We did some things. We're not proud of all of them. But I mean, we're not going to cede our country to the Chinese or something like this because of them. So this is what happened. This is what happened. Now back to the glories. I think that that's traditionally how history has been taught, and cynically, there's an argument for that. But in this case, I don't even think that would be necessary in the United States. The United States does have a fairly glorious history. So obviously, there are dark components of American history. When slavery was legal, and every civilized European, West African, East Asian nation had the institution of slavery, we, for example, the Shores of Tripoli line in the Marine Corps hymn refers to the fact that we fought powerful black slavers, the Barbary pirates, black and Moorish, in order to stop their trafficking in Shanghaied American captives, essentially. So this was a universal practice. When slavery existed, we had slaves. That is shameful. We didn't let women, including white women, vote until 1920, by the way, if you want to get into this dispute with. I recently had a Black, Irish, and Jewish American friend of mine arguing about who was the most oppressed, quote unquote. They were just passing time. And my fiance leaned in the room and was like, "You're all men." And that is accurate if you want to get into an oppress off. I mean, all three of those groups could vote by 1865, whereas women not for years yet to come. But I mean, all of that in the past is negative. But the fact remains that America was the first free, large, modern democracy. I mean, the first country to really fly the flag of the democracy since the Venetian Republic. That's pretty impressive. When you ask what distinguishes us, we beat the damned king we had and put rights into place. It's bad that we didn't give them to everyone originally, but no one else at the time had any. People in other nations were still subjects rather than free citizens. The Constitution refers to that, the citizens and subjects of other places. So a lot of the 1619 history strikes me as frankly untrue. I mean, the lead 1619 Project essay at one point claims the Revolutionary War was fought to promote slavery and unfreedom, which is a damned odd take when you think about it. I mean, that was the anti-freedom movement. The claim is made that Black people had to fight essentially alone for civil rights. That, again, is not at all true. When the Civil Rights Act was passed in Congress, the Senate was 99% Caucasian. I don't mean to be glib, but I think the other guy was Chinese. I mean, so these are things that actually happened historically. There, as the 1776 Project, which I'm a founding member of, 1776 Unites, as they point out, I mean, there's a history of Black millionaires and military leaders and so on, going back to Robert Smalls and Madam C.J. Walker and so forth. That's ignored by these people. So this sort of thing is an issue in the institutions. And I will say, not conspiratorially, just factually, this to some extent is a product of an old Marxist idea.
Yeah.
There's a communist theorist, Antonin Gramsci, who very cynically at one point says, well, we need to understand we're not going to take over the military. We're not going to take over sport or agriculture. What are the other bases of power? Organized religion, trading floor style business. Like communist SJWs are not going to dominate those fields. So what we need to get into is the institutions of discourse, where there's this sort of tradition of free, fair discussion. Everyone's an intellectual. You could call these the nerd fields. But I mean, very specifically, the media, the large NGOs, what else would you put in there? Academia. And the march through the institutions, as it's called, has begun in a number of countries, including China, France, and I would say the USA, and it often produces successful results. I mean, right now we see a situation where something like 92% of college professors identify as liberals, leftists, or Marxists. So that's a bit of an issue. I would be on the extreme right for a college campus, and I'm just some business guy. I mean, I don't have a, costume of Alexander Hamilton in my office or a rattlesnake flag or anything like this. So, I mean, and I think that's a problem. I mean, I think there should be Tea Party members on the campus. I certainly think there should be well-trained Catholic or evangelical theologians to debate the guys in the bio department or the postmodernists. Why not? They shouldn't be teaching biology classes, but they should be there. They should definitely be in philosophy, political science. But so right now we're in a situation where there aren't any. Is there hope is really your question. I think so, because people have eyes. I mean, I think an increasing number of people are pursuing private schooling. I mean, in the Black community, certainly you see in the charter academies like KIPP. And there's a dramatic difference between how Black kids perform in KIPP-style charter schools and how Black kids perform in inner-city public schools. I mean, KIPP's SAT last year, I looked at their package I thought about giving. I mean, it wasn't incredible, but it was 1,019, I think. Whereas the SAT for all African-American kids, and we're now a fairly middle-class population, was 950, and for Black quote-unquote hood kids was about 800. So if you look at where KIPP draws its students, I mean, you're looking at a 220-point jump based just on actual schooling, based around repetition, athletics, a tough teacher. I mean, the things that have always been done. So I think many more people will pick those models. I mean, you're seeing a surge in homeschooling. I mean, those two things together, private school, charter school, homeschool, are now, I'd say 20% of students, if you look at the real numbers. Even within the curriculum, I mean, the 1776 Project is drawing up our own curriculum, where we want to emphasize Black history, sure, in addition to the many white allies and military leaders and so on that worked on the same causes, but it depends who you pick. I mean, why would you focus on brutalized slaves as opposed to Robert Smalls, who pretended to be a sea captain, stole a Confederate warship and piloted it to the Union and then joined the Army? That's a story worth telling, as opposed to, master, please, no. Which seems to be the tone of all this social justice stuff, 12 years a slave and so on down the line. I was no years a slave, so I'd rather hear about some victories.
Wilfred Reilly is an assistant professor of political science at Kentucky State University. His books include Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo. You can follow him on Twitter at Will_Beast630. Wilfred, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks. Enjoyed talking to you.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.